Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. It was my third month working as a cabin steward on the Celestial Voyager, one of those massive cruise ships that carries about 4,000 passengers across the Caribbean. I was 22, fresh out of hospitality school in Miami, eager to see the world while making decent money. The job wasn't glamorous, mostly cleaning rooms, replacing towels, arranging those little towel animals that guests love to photograph. But the pay was good. I got to travel, and my coworkers from the Philippines, Indonesia, and Eastern Europe had become like family. We'd spend our few free hours playing cards in the crew mess, or watching movies on someone's laptop, all of us thousands of miles from home, bound together by the strange reality of life at sea. That particular Thursday in late September started like any other day, with me pushing my cleaning cart down the narrow corridors of Deck 7, humming along to whatever song was stuck in my head from the crew bar the night before. Around 11 in the morning, I knocked on cabin 7234, waited the standard 10 seconds, then announced myself, and knocked again. No response. I checked my list. The Thompsons, an elderly couple from Nebraska, hadn't put out the Do Not Disturb sign. I used my master keycard and stepped inside, immediately noticing the strange stillness in the air. Mr. Thompson was lying on the bed, fully dressed in yesterday's clothes, his face an unnatural shade of gray. Mrs. Thompson was nowhere to be seen, probably at the breakfast buffet, I thought. I approached slowly, calling his name softly at first, then louder. When I touched his shoulder to give him a gentle shake, his skin was cold, and I knew instantly. The way his eyes stared at nothing, the complete absence of chest movement, the stiffness in his limbs. My training kicked in and I reached for my radio to call medical. But before I could press the button, my supervisor Carlos appeared in the doorway, as if he'd been waiting nearby. Carlos stepped into the cabin and closed the door behind him with a quiet click that seemed too deliberate. He didn't even look at Mr. Thompson's body at first. His eyes were fixed on me, studying my reaction. "Put the radio down, Miguel," he said in that calm voice he used when dealing with difficult passengers. I started to protest, to explain that we needed to call medical immediately, that protocol was clear about these situations. But Carlos moved past me to the body, checking for a pulse he obviously wouldn't find, then pulled out his own phone and typed something quickly. "Medical can't come right now," he said, which made no sense because medical was always on standby. "We need to handle this quietly. Mrs. Thompson is at the spa until 2. We have time." He went to the closet and pulled out the large laundry bag we used for dirty linens, one of those industrial ones that could fit a whole room's worth of sheets. My mouth went dry as I realized what he was suggesting. "Help me get him in," Carlos said, already positioning the bag next to the bed. I stood there, unable to move, watching him work with an efficiency that told me he'd done this before. He looked up at me and his expression changed. Not angry, but something worse. Disappointed, like I was failing some unspoken test. "Miguel, you want to keep this job? You want to keep sending money home to your mother in Orlando? Then you help me now, and you forget what you saw." The mention of my mother made my chest tighten. Carlos knew things about all of us, knew our situations, our debts, our reasons for being here. He grabbed Mr. Mia Thompson's shoulders while I stood frozen. And that's when he said something that made everything click into place. "Deck 2, storage room C47. We'll use the service elevator during lunch rush when everyone's distracted. Security won't check the cameras if I tell them not to." The casual way he said it, like he was explaining how to fold towels properly, made me realize this was procedure for him. My legs moved before my brain could process what I was doing. Together we maneuvered Mr. Thompson's stiff body into the laundry bag. He was heavier than he looked, and rigor mortis had already started to set in, making his limbs difficult to bend. The sound of his wedding ring scraping against the bag's zipper will stay with me forever. Carlos worked methodically, checking his watch every few minutes. wiping down surfaces we'd touched with a cloth from his pocket. He straightened the bed sheets, fluffed the pillows, even placed Mr. Thompson's reading glasses neatly on the nightstand next to a half-finished crossword puzzle. "Mrs. Thompson will think he went to the casino," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "She always complains he disappears there for hours." When we were done, the cabin looked exactly as it should, except for the industrial laundry bag sitting in the middle of the floor, holding the body of a man who'd probably saved his whole life for this anniversary cruise. We waited until 12:30, when Carlos knew the lunch buffet would be at its peak. He made me push the regular cleaning cart while he handled the laundry bag on a separate cart, covered with fresh towels. The service elevator was empty, just as he'd predicted. As we descended to Deck 2, Carlos spoke quietly, never looking at me directly. "You think this is cruel, but imagine the panic if passengers knew. Imagine Mrs. Thompson finding out in front of everyone, the whole ship talking about it, taking photos, posting on social media while she's trying to grieve. This way she gets the news privately, with dignity, when we dock tomorrow." His logic was twisted but almost made sense in that suffocating elevator. Storage room C-47 was at the end of a corridor I'd never seen before, behind the crew laundry. The door had a special lock that required Carlos's supervisor keycard. Inside, the temperature was freezing, and I could see my breath forming small clouds in the air. The room wasn't empty. Along the back wall, 5 other industrial laundry bags were lined up, each with a small tag attached to the zipper. Carlos added Mr. Thompson to the row, pulling out a marker to write 7234 9-26 on a fresh tag. The other tags had similar markings, cabin numbers and dates going back 2 weeks. "Natural causes," Carlos said, noticing me staring at the bags. "Heart attacks, strokes, old age. Happens more than you'd think with the demographics on these cruises. Average age of our passengers is 67. He said it like he was reciting statistics from a training manual. I wanted to ask why they weren't in the ship's morgue. I knew we had one. It was mentioned in our orientation. But the answer was obvious now. The official morgue probably had a capacity of 2, maybe 3 bodies. This hidden freezer was the overflow system, the dirty secret that kept the cruise running smoothly, while people died quietly in their cabins, their families none the wiser until we reached port. Carlos locked the door and turned to face me. "Tomorrow morning, when we dock in Fort Lauderdale, a special medical team will come aboard before any passengers disembark. They'll handle everything discreetly. Death certificates will show the correct date and cause. The families will get the bodies for burial. Insurance claims will process normally. But the cruise line avoids the headlines, the bad publicity, the empty cabins for the rest of the season." He pulled out an envelope from his jacket pocket, $500 in cash. "This is yours, not a bribe, just a bonus for handling a difficult situation professionally. You'll get one every time you help with this. Every time." He expected this to happen again. He expected me to be part of this system, this conspiracy of silence that turned human beings into logistics problems to be solved. I took the money because refusing would have meant something worse than compliance. It would have meant I couldn't be trusted. That afternoon, I watched Mrs. Thompson return from the spa, relaxed and smiling, holding a shopping bag from the gift shop. She knocked on her cabin door, calling out, "Harold, I bought you that shirt you liked." When he didn't answer, she used her key and went inside. 5 minutes later, she came to the guest services desk, worried but not panicked, reporting that her husband was missing. The staff followed protocol perfectly. They made announcements, they searched public areas, they reviewed security footage that Carlos had already ensured would show nothing useful. Mrs. Thompson spent the rest of the day increasingly distraught, surrounded by other passengers who tried to comfort her, sharing their own stories of husbands who wandered off on ships. At dinner, I saw her sitting alone at their table for 2, his chair empty, still hoping he'd walk through the door with some silly explanation about losing track of time at the poker tables. The weight of what I knew sat in my stomach like a stone. That night, I couldn't eat. I kept thinking about Mr. Thompson in that freezer, in that bag with only a cabin number to identify who he'd been. I thought about his wife sleeping alone, not knowing she was already a widow. Around midnight, I found myself back on deck 2, standing outside C-47. I could hear the cooling system humming through the door. Using my regular keycard, I tried to open it. Access denied, of course. Only supervisors could enter. But I noticed something else. There were other storage rooms along that corridor, C-45, C-46, C-48, C-49. When I pressed my ear against C-46, I heard the same mechanical humming. I tried to do the math. If each room could hold 6 or 7 bodies, and there were at least 5 cold storage rooms, and cruises ran year-round, how many deaths were they hiding? How many families were lied to? How many crew members like me had been pulled into this system, paid off, sworn to silence through fear and cash? The next morning, just as Carlos had promised, we docked in Fort Lauderdale. I watched from a crew deck as unmarked white vans pulled up to a service entrance I'd never noticed before. Men in medical uniforms, but no company logos, wheeled gurneys up a ramp, moving with the same practiced efficiency I'd seen in Carlos. They were gone within an hour, before most passengers had even finished breakfast. Later that day, Mrs. Thompson was called to the medical center. The ship's doctor, a pleasant woman from South Africa named Dr. Kruger, told her they'd found her husband collapsed in a maintenance area where passengers weren't supposed to go, that he'd apparently suffered a massive heart attack, that everything possible had been done, but it was too late. I know because I was cleaning the corridor outside and heard every word through the thin walls. Mrs. Thompson's sobs were quiet, dignified, muffled by the doctor's shoulder. She thanked them for trying to save him. She actually thanked them. I quit 3 days later, after we'd returned to sea with a fresh load of passengers. I told Carlos I had a family emergency, and he didn't argue. He just looked at me with those knowing eyes and said, "Not everyone's cut out for the realities of this industry." He handed me my final pay envelope. It had an extra $1,000 inside. Blood money, or silence money, I'm not sure which. I never reported what I saw. Who would believe me? What proof did I have? The cruise line would deny everything. Carlos would disappear into another ship, and I'd be just another disgruntled employee making wild accusations. But I know what I saw in that freezer. I know Mr. Thompson died alone in his cabin and spent his last day on Earth in a laundry bag with a number tag instead of his name. Sometimes I check cruise message boards, looking for posts from people whose loved ones died at sea, wondering if they ever questioned the official story. The industry processes over 30 million passengers a year. If even 0.5% die on board, that's 150,000 bodies that need to be handled quietly, efficiently, without disturbing the paradise illusion. I still have nightmares about those storage rooms, about what's behind all those locked doors on ships floating in international waters where laws become suggestions and death becomes an inconvenience to be managed. I spent 6 years as a communications officer on various cruise ships before that night in 2022 changed everything. Most people picture cruise work as glamorous, tropical destinations, endless buffets, meeting people from all over the world. The reality is 12-hour shifts in a windowless room filled with monitors, radio equipment, and the constant hum of electronics. I was stationed on the Meridian Pearl, one of those massive floating cities that carries 4,000 passengers through the Mediterranean. My job was simple enough: monitor all radio frequencies, log communications, coordinate with other vessels, and relay important information to the bridge. That particular night in early August, we were somewhere between Sicily and Malta, cruising through calm waters under a moonless sky. I'd just finished my dinner, lukewarm pasta from the crew mess, and settled in for what I expected would be another routine graveyard shift. The communications room was tucked away on deck 3, far from passenger areas. Just me, my colleague Brandon, who was catching some sleep in the corner, and walls lined with equipment that looked like it belonged in a submarine movie. Around 2 a.m., I picked up something on Channel 16, the International Distress Frequency. At first, it was just static mixed with what sounded like voices, barely audible through the interference. I fine-tuned the frequency, adjusting the squelch and gain controls until the transmission became clearer. It was another cruise ship, the Ocean Harmony, operating about 40 nautical miles from our position. Their communications officer sounded panicked, his voice cracking as he repeated the same message. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Ocean Harmony. We have 17 passengers unaccounted for. Repeat, 17 souls missing. Conducted 3 full searches of the vessel, requesting immediate assistance from any ships in vicinity." The timestamp on my equipment showed 02:13 when I logged the first transmission. I immediately reached for the direct line to our bridge, but before I could dial, more transmissions flooded in. The Ocean Harmony's officer was now communicating with what sounded like the Italian Coast Guard, though their responses were breaking up badly. Through the static, I heard fragments. "Searched all public areas. Cameras show nothing. Between 23 and 1 hours. No signs of struggle. Personal belongings still in cabins." Each detail made my chest tighten. 17 people don't just vanish from a cruise ship. I'd been doing this job long enough to know that when someone goes overboard, there's usually witnesses, security footage, something. But 17 people disappearing within a 2-hour window with no trace? I started recording everything on our backup system while simultaneously transcribing the key points by hand. Brandon stirred in his chair but didn't wake up. He'd been pulling double shifts all week and could sleep through anything. The transmissions continued for another 20 minutes, growing increasingly desperate. The Ocean Harmony's captain had taken over the radio now, his deep voice cutting through the static with practiced authority that couldn't quite mask his concern. He was requesting helicopter support, asking nearby vessels to adjust course for search patterns, coordinating with maritime authorities from at least 3 different countries. I plotted their position on my navigation screen. They were close enough that we could reach them in 2 hours at full speed. Protocol demanded that I report this immediately to our bridge officer. I grabbed the phone again, dialed extension 501, and waited. Lieutenant Morrison answered on the 3rd ring, sounding irritated at being disturbed. When I explained the situation, there was a long pause. Then he said something that made my entire body go rigid. "Keep monitoring. Don't log anything officially yet. I'm coming down." 5 minutes later, Morrison walked in, but he wasn't alone. Our hotel director, a thin man named Garrison who always wore perfectly pressed suits even at 3 in the morning, followed him into the room. They both looked wide awake, like they'd been expecting something like this. Garrison went straight to my station, leaning over to look at my handwritten notes while Morrison stood by the door, arms crossed. "Play back everything you've recorded," Garrison ordered. His cologne was overwhelming in the small space, something expensive that made my nose itch. I hit playback, and we listened to the Ocean Harmony's distress calls again. Garrison's expression never changed, just that blank corporate stare I'd seen during staff meetings. When the recording ended, he pulled out his phone and stepped into the hallway. I could hear him speaking in hushed tones, though I couldn't make out the words through the heavy door. Morrison moved closer to my station, scanning through the digital logs on my screen. "How many other vessels have acknowledged these transmissions?" he asked. I pulled up the frequency log. 2 cargo ships had responded, along with an Italian patrol boat, all confirming they'd received the distress calls and were adjusting course to assist. Morrison nodded slowly, then did something I'd never seen in my 6 years at sea. He reached over and started deleting entries from our communication log, not just archiving or marking them classified, actually removing them from our system entirely. "Sir, those are official maritime records," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We're required by international law to maintain those." He didn't even look at me, just kept clicking delete. "No, what we're required to do is protect our passengers from unnecessary panic. News about a competitor's crisis could cause chaos on our ship. Imagine if 4,000 people suddenly decided they wanted off." Garrison returned, slipping his phone into his jacket pocket. "The situation is being handled through proper channels," he announced, though his tone suggested those channels had nothing to do with maritime safety. From this moment forward, we received no distress calls tonight. Our logs will show routine commercial traffic only. The Ocean Harmony situation doesn't concern us. He turned to Brandon, who was now awake and looking confused. That goes for you too. You were asleep. You heard nothing. Brandon glanced at me, then back at Garrison and simply nodded. Smart kid. He had a family back in the States and needed this job. Garrison pulled out a tablet and had us both sign something labeled as a communications protocol review, corporate speak for a gag order. The document was pages long, filled with legal language about proprietary information and competitive intelligence. Nowhere did it mention the 17 missing people who were somewhere out there in the dark Mediterranean waters. For the next 2 hours, I sat at my station listening to the ongoing search and rescue operations while pretending to monitor routine channels. The Ocean Harmony's transmissions grew more frantic. They'd found personal items floating in the water: shoes, a handbag, what looked like pieces of clothing. The Italian Coast Guard had deployed helicopters with searchlights, sweeping the dark waters in expanding grid patterns. A Norwegian cargo vessel reported possible debris about 2 miles from the Ocean Harmony's position. Through it all, I maintained our fake log, entering fictional routine communications while the real crisis unfolded in my headphones. Around 4:30 a.m., Garrison finally left, but not before reminding me that my contract included substantial financial penalties for violating confidentiality agreements. Morrison stayed until his shift ended at 6 a.m., sitting in the corner where Brandon had been, occasionally glancing at me to make sure I was following orders. When my replacement arrived at 8 a.m., a cheerful woman named Janet who had no idea what had transpired during the night, I handed over the falsified log without a word. Walking back to my cabin, I passed hundreds of passengers heading to breakfast, laughing, taking selfies, completely unaware that just 40 miles away, families were receiving the worst news of their lives. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those 17 people. Were they traveling together? Were they strangers who'd met the same fate? The Ocean Harmony's manifest would list them as missing, their cabins would be sealed, and somewhere, 17 families would be destroyed. I lay in my narrow bunk, staring at the ceiling, listening to the constant rumble of our engines. Every cruise ship has cameras covering almost every inch of public space. For 17 people to disappear without being caught on a single camera meant either a massive technical failure or something far more orchestrated. That evening, I made a decision that probably ended my maritime career. Before my shift, I stopped by an internet cafe in port. We docked in Valletta, Malta for the day. Using a prepaid connection that couldn't be traced back to me, I searched for news about the Ocean Harmony. Nothing. Not a single article, blog post, or social media mention about missing passengers. I checked maritime incident databases, Coast Guard reports, even shipping industry forums where sailors gossip about everything. The rescue operation I'd listened to for hours, involving multiple vessels and helicopters, had left no digital footprint whatsoever. The Ocean Harmony was listed as operating normally, currently docked in Marseille according to the Port Authority website. Either everyone involved had agreed to bury this story, or something even stranger was happening. I spent €30 printing out everything I could find about the ship's recent movements, passenger reviews from previous cruises, anything that might explain what I'd heard. When I returned to the ship for my evening shift, Garrison was waiting in the communications room. He wasn't alone. 2 security officers flanked him, and there were boxes stacked near my station. "We're upgrading the equipment," he said, though his smile never reached his eyes. "You'll be transferred to the Celestial Dream, departing from Barcelona next week. Promotion to Senior Communications Officer, 20% pay increase." It wasn't a promotion, it was exile. They were separating me from Brandon, from anyone who knew about that night. The security officers watched as I packed my personal items from the desk drawers, photos, my coffee mug, the notebook where I'd transcribed those desperate calls. Garrison held out his hand for the notebook. When I hesitated, One of the security officers stepped forward. I handed it over. Garrison flipped through it, tore out the pages with my handwriting from that night, and fed them into a shredder that had mysteriously appeared in our usually equipment-only room. The next 6 days before my transfer were surreal. I worked my shifts, maintained the logs, acted normal. But every night I'd lie awake wondering how many other communications officers had heard similar calls and been silenced. How many missing passenger cases were being erased from existence? On my last night aboard the Meridian Pearl, Brandon found me during dinner. He slipped me a USB drive hidden inside a napkin, whispered, "Backup from that night," and walked away. I never saw him again. I quit 3 months later. Couldn't handle the weight of what I knew. The USB drive contained 4 hours of recordings. Every transmission from the Ocean Harmony, every coordinate, every desperate plea for help. I've shared it with journalists, maritime safety organizations, even law enforcement. They all say the same thing. Without official logs or corroborating evidence, it's just audio that could be fabricated. 17 people vanished that night, and the only proof sits in a safety deposit box in Geneva, waiting for someone to believe it's real. The galley kitchens on cruise ships become your entire world after a while, and I'd been running them for 12 years when everything went to hell that April morning in 2023. I was 43, divorced, and honestly preferred the constant motion of the sea to any apartment back in Boston. Most people don't realize that executive chefs on these massive vessels oversee operations that feed 4,000 passengers and 1,500 crew members every single day. We're talking about 21 restaurants, 800 pounds of lobster per voyage, and a supply chain that would make most hotel managers weep. I'd worked my way up from a line cook on smaller boats to managing the entire food operation on one of the industry's flagship vessels. The money was excellent, the team respected me, and I genuinely loved watching sunrise through the porthole windows while inspecting the morning bread production. That particular Monday started like any other, with me arriving at the main galley at 4:30 a.m., my clipboard ready for inventory checks, completely unaware that within 6 hours I'd be facing the kind of decision that destroys careers and maybe lives. The first complaint came through at 10:15, just as breakfast service was winding down and we were prepping for the lunch rush. Nancy, one of our guest services coordinators, appeared at my office door with that particular expression that meant trouble. Her usually bright face pulled tight with concern, her fingers drumming against her radio. A family of 5 from Deck 7 had reported severe stomach problems after eating at the Sunrise Buffet, and they weren't the only ones. Within 20 minutes, my phone was ringing nonstop, and the medical bay started sending urgent messages about passengers flooding in with violent symptoms, vomiting, severe cramping, some people collapsing in hallways. Dr. Brennan, our chief medical officer, a former Navy surgeon who never panicked about anything, called me directly and said we might be looking at over 60 cases already, with more coming every minute. The pattern was clear. Everyone affected had eaten breakfast between 7 and 9 that morning, mostly from the main buffet, but some from our specialty restaurants too. I immediately initiated our containment protocol, shutting down all food service except for sealed beverages and prepackaged items, then assembled my senior staff in the main prep kitchen to figure out what the hell had gone wrong. We pulled every single item that had been served that morning: eggs, bacon, sausages, fruit salads, pastries, yogurt parfaits, everything. My sous chef Kevin and I personally inspected each batch, checking temperatures, examining prep logs, even tasting small samples ourselves despite the risk. The scrambled eggs looked perfect, fluffy and yellow like always. The bacon was crispy. The hollandaise sauce had been made fresh at 6 a.m. exactly according to protocol. Every temperature log showed proper readings. All the HACCP charts were filled out correctly. Timestamps matched. Signatures were in place. But something was catastrophically wrong, and the numbers kept climbing. Dr. Brennan's latest update put us at 143 passengers affected, with 12 in critical condition. The captain had already notified corporate headquarters and the nearest port authority, and I knew that within hours we'd have health inspectors crawling through every inch of my kitchens. The weird thing was that my staff seemed unusually quiet during our emergency meeting, avoiding eye contact in a way that made the hair on my neck stand up. Kevin pulled me aside near the walk-in freezers while the others were gathering samples for testing, his face pale and sweaty, in a way that had nothing to do with the kitchen heat. He'd been with me for 3 years, a solid professional who'd never given me any reason to doubt him. But now, he kept glancing at the security cameras like he was checking their positions. "Chef, we need to talk, but not here," he whispered, gesturing toward the loading dock area where deliveries came in during port days. I followed him through the maze of storage rooms, past the blast chillers and the dry goods storage, until we reached a corner where the camera coverage had a known blind spot, something I'd reported to management months ago but they'd never fixed. Kevin rubbed his face hard with both hands before speaking, and when he finally looked at me, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. "The delivery last Friday in Port Canaveral," he started, his voice barely audible over the distant hum of refrigeration units. "Corporate made us take a shipment that wasn't on our manifest. 3 pallets of frozen proteins, no proper documentation, just a verbal order from someone way above our pay grade." I stared at him, trying to process what he was telling me while my phone buzzed incessantly with updates from the crisis. Kevin continued, explaining how the night shift had been instructed to use these unmarked packages for the breakfast sausages and meat preparations, mixing them with our regular stock to stretch the inventory through the next 2 weeks at sea. The packages had arrived partially thawed, he said, with ice crystals melting and refreezing in patterns that suggested multiple temperature breaks during transport. But here's where it got worse. Our night supervisor, Robert, had been specifically told by someone in corporate procurement to bypass the usual receiving protocols, skip the temperature checks, and just get everything into the freezers before the morning shift arrived. Kevin showed me photos on his phone that he'd taken secretly. Boxes with labels that had been peeled off and replaced, dates that looked altered with different ink, and most disturbing of all, a faint stamp on one box that appeared to be from a supplier we'd blacklisted 2 years ago for repeated safety violations. The more he talked, the clearer it became that this wasn't just negligence or a mistake. This was deliberate, systematic corner-cutting to save money, and now people were seriously ill because of it. The head of guest services burst through the dock door before I could respond to Kevin, her face flushed and panicked. "Chef, we have 3 passengers being airlifted to shore right now," she gasped, clutching her chest as she caught her breath. 2 elderly women and a 7-year-old boy, all in critical condition with severe dehydration and organ stress. The Coast Guard is 30 minutes out. The weight of those words hit me like a physical blow. A child was fighting for his life because of food that came from my kitchens. Food that I was responsible for, even if I hadn't known about the contaminated shipment. I thought about my own nephew, just about that age, and felt bile rise in my throat. Behind her, I could see other department heads gathering in the main galley, including our hotel director, Mr. Fitzgerald, a company man through and through who'd been with the cruise line for 25 years. He caught my eye through the doorway and made a subtle cutting motion across his throat, a clear message to keep quiet about whatever I might have discovered. The ship's internet had already been throttled to prevent passengers from posting on social media, and I knew from experience that corporate's crisis management team was probably already crafting a story about an isolated norovirus outbreak, completely unrelated to food handling. I walked back into the main galley, my mind racing through the implications of what I knew versus what I was expected to do. "Mr. Pahu." Fitzgerald immediately cornered me near the pass where we usually plated desserts, speaking in that smooth, practiced tone that company executives perfect after years of handling disasters. "Chef, the testing lab will be here within the hour," he said, straightening his tie with manicured fingers that had never touched a hot pan. "They'll find nothing because there's nothing to find. Our supplies are all properly sourced, properly stored, and properly prepared. Whatever made these people sick came from somewhere else. Perhaps they ate at port yesterday. Perhaps it's viral. Your kitchens are spotless, your procedures are impeccable, and that's exactly what you'll tell the investigators." He placed a hand on my shoulder, squeezing just hard enough to convey threat rather than comfort. "You've got 14 years until full pension, if I remember correctly. Your son's at Northwestern University studying medicine, expensive school. It would be unfortunate if budget cuts forced us to restructure the galley management." The message was crystal clear. Play along or lose everything I'd worked for, everything my family depended on. My phone rang with another call from Dr. Brennan, and this time his voice had lost all professional composure. "We're at 208 cases now, and I need to know what they ate because standard food poisoning treatment isn't working," he said urgently. "Some passengers are showing unusual symptoms. Their white blood cell counts are through the roof. Liver enzymes are spiking in ways I've never seen from typical bacteria. Whatever this is, it's not Salmonella or E. coli or any of the usual suspects." I could hear chaos in the background of his call, alarms beeping, people retching, someone crying hysterically. Meanwhile, Fitzgerald stood 3 feet away from me, arms crossed, watching my every expression. I told Dr. Brennan I'd get back to him and hung up, my mind churning through the horrible calculus of this situation. If I stayed quiet, more people might get sick from the remaining contaminated stock still in our freezers. But if I spoke up, corporate would destroy me financially and professionally, blacklisting me from every cruise line and major hotel chain they had connections with, which was basically all of them. They'd paint me as a negligent chef who'd failed to maintain standards, making me the scapegoat while the executives who'd actually ordered the corrupt shipment remained untouched in their shoreside offices. The health inspectors arrived faster than expected, a team of 3 officials in Navy windbreakers who immediately commandeered my office and started demanding documentation. I handed over everything they asked for, the filtered version, the official logs that showed perfect compliance, while the real evidence Kevin had shown me burned like acid in my consciousness. They took samples from every station, swabbed surfaces, checked temperatures, interviewed my staff who all stuck to the script with practiced efficiency. During a brief break, I excused myself and went to the crew bathroom, where I found Kevin's assistant, Maria, crying in one of the stalls. She'd been working the night shift when the contaminated meat came in, and through her tears, she told me that Robert had made them repackage everything, transferring the suspicious proteins into our standard containers with our regular labels. He said it was a special arrangement to help the company during supply chain problems, she sobbed, mascara streaming down her cheeks. But chef, some of those packages, they smelled wrong even while frozen, like ammonia mixed with something sweet and rotten. We tried to refuse, but Robert said we'd all be fired and put off at the next port without our wages. She showed me videos on her phone that she'd secretly recorded, timestamp showing 3:47 a.m. last Saturday, of Robert and 2 other supervisors literally peeling labels off boxes and replacing them with fresh ones from our standard supplier. I made a decision in that bathroom that would change everything. I told Maria to send me those videos immediately, then walked back to my office where the inspectors were still working. Mr. Fitzgerald had positioned himself in the corner, supposedly reviewing paperwork but really monitoring every word I said. I pulled out my personal laptop, not the company one, and started compiling everything. Kevin's photos, Maria's videos, screenshots of the altered delivery manifests, even recordings I'd made of previous conversations where corporate had pushed us to cut costs. The lead inspector, a woman named Diane with 30 years of experience and eyes that missed nothing, noticed my agitation. "Chef, is there something you'd like to share with us?" she asked quietly, and I saw Fitzgerald tense up, his hand moving to his phone probably to alert legal. I looked at Diane, then at Fitzgerald, then thought about that 7-year-old boy fighting for his life in a helicopter somewhere over the ocean. "Yes," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "But I need protection from retaliation, and I need it in writing before I show you what really happened here." The room went completely silent, except for the distant sound of the ship's engines, and I could practically hear my career crumbling like overbaked pastry. What happened next was like watching a dam burst in slow motion. Diane immediately called for federal marshals who were apparently already on standby at the nearest port, then began documenting everything while Fitzgerald tried desperately to reach corporate legal on his phone. Within an hour, they'd seized all the remaining contaminated products, locked down the entire kitchen operation, and started interviewing every single member of my staff separately. The truth came pouring out. Apparently, this wasn't the first time, just the first time people had gotten this sick. Robert, when faced with federal charges, cracked completely and admitted that corporate had been doing this for 18 months across their entire fleet, saving approximately $12 million by purchasing rejected and expired proteins through shell companies and relabeling them. The ammonia smell Maria had noticed was from chemicals used to mask decomposition, a practice that's literally criminal in food service. Dr. Brennan later confirmed that the unusual symptoms were from a rare bacteria that only develops in meat that's been thawed and refrozen multiple times in contaminated conditions. By evening, FBI agents had boarded the ship, and Fitzgerald was in custody along with 3 other executives who'd tried to destroy evidence. The 7-year-old boy survived after intensive treatment, though his family would deal with complications for months. The cruise line tried to fire me the next day, but the whistleblower protection Diane had arranged held firm, and the story exploded across international news within 72 hours. I testified in federal court 6 months later, providing evidence that led to criminal charges against 14 corporate executives and a complete restructuring of the company's food safety protocols. The cruise line paid out $300 million in settlements and criminal fines, and new federal regulations were passed requiring independent food safety audits for all cruise operations. I never worked on a ship again. No cruise line would touch me after I'd exposed the industry's dirty secret, but I found something better. Now I run a food safety consulting firm that trains kitchen staff to recognize and report exactly these kinds of violations, and Maria works with me as my lead inspector. Kevin took over as executive chef on a competitor's ship, where he implemented the strictest food safety standards in the fleet. Sometimes I miss the sunrise through those porthole windows and the rhythm of life at sea, but then I remember that little boy's family sending me a photo of him on his 8th birthday, healthy and grinning with cake all over his face. That photo sits on my desk now, reminding me every day that some things matter more than careers or corporate loyalty. The galley might have been my whole world once, but saving lives by speaking truth became my purpose, even if it meant I'd never sail again. February 2016 was when everything went sideways for me. I was 34, recently divorced, and desperately needed the money when I took that job as a night watchman on the Oceanic Pearl, one of those massive cruise ships that holds about 4,000 passengers. The pay was decent, better than anything I could find on land at the time, and they were offering 6-month contracts with overtime guaranteed. I'd worked security at a mall in Phoenix before, nothing fancy, just checking doors and walking around empty corridors at night. The cruise line job seemed like the same deal, except floating. My buddy Frank had done it for 2 years and said it was easy money. Just patrol the decks, make sure drunk passengers got back to their rooms safely, and keep an eye on restricted areas. Simple enough, right? The first 3 weeks were exactly what I expected. I'd start my shift at 11 p.m., do my rounds through the passenger decks, check the pool areas, make sure nobody was climbing on railings or doing anything stupid after too many drinks at the bars. Most nights I'd help maybe 2 or 3 people who couldn't find their cabin, guide them back while they rambled about how amazing their vacation was. The ship had this whole city inside it, restaurants, theaters, casinos, shopping areas, and at night, when most passengers were asleep, it became this quiet, humming maze of corridors and stairwells. I actually enjoyed those first weeks, walking through the empty spaces, listening to the ocean through the walls, feeling the slight sway under my feet. It was peaceful in a way that my life hadn't been for a while. It was a Wednesday night in my 4th week when I first noticed something weird. I was doing my usual patrol near the aft section of Deck 5 when I saw 2 crew members I recognized from the entertainment staff, a guy named Victor from Romania and a woman called Sophia from Greece. They were practically carrying this passenger, a middle-aged woman in a sparkly dress who could barely stand. Now I'd seen plenty of drunk passengers, but this was different. Her head was completely limp, rolling back and forth with each step, and her feet were dragging on the carpet. I started walking toward them to help, figured they were taking her to the medical center on Deck 2, but then they turned left instead of right. Left led to a service elevator that went down to the crew quarters and storage areas, definitely not where passengers belonged. When I called out to them, Victor just looked at me, put his finger to his lips, and shook his head. Sophia mouthed something that looked like special arrangement, and they disappeared into the elevator. The next morning, I mentioned it to Gary, the security supervisor who worked days. He'd been with the cruise line for 15 years, knew everything about everything. Gary just laughed it off, told me sometimes VIP passengers get special recovery services when they party too hard. Private medical attention in better-equipped rooms away from the regular medical bay. He said the cruise line didn't advertise it, but wealthy passengers paid extra for discretion when they got too wasted. Made sense at the time, I guess. Rich people always got different treatment, and the cruise industry was all about keeping high rollers happy. But something about the way Victor had looked at me stuck in my mind. It wasn't conspiratorial, like we were in on some secret together. It was more like a warning, like I should mind my own business and forget what I saw. 2 nights later, it happened again. Different crew members this time. Guys from the restaurant staff I'd seen around but didn't know by name. They had a young man, maybe 25, wearing an expensive-looking suit that was all disheveled. This time I was closer, could see his face clearly under the corridor lights. His eyes were open but completely unfocused, pupils dilated so wide they looked black. Drool was running down his chin. The weird part was how systematic they were about it. One guy had him under the arms, the other had his legs, and they were moving fast, efficient, like they'd done this many times before. They took the same service elevator, going down to the restricted areas. I followed them this time, took the stairs down to Deck 1, but when I got there, the corridor was empty. Just the hum of the engines and the smell of industrial cleaning products. There were dozens of doors down there, storage rooms, crew quarters, mechanical areas. They could have gone anywhere. I started paying more attention after that, changing my patrol routes to spend more time near those service elevators. Over the next week, I saw it happen 4 more times, always late, always between 2 and 4 a.m. when the ship was quietest. Always crew members from different departments, entertainment, food service, housekeeping, carrying passengers who were beyond drunk, practically unconscious. And always down to the restricted areas below the passenger decks. I started keeping notes in my phone, writing down dates, times, descriptions of the passengers. There was a pattern forming that I couldn't ignore. The passengers were always alone, always wearing expensive clothes or jewelry, always so intoxicated they couldn't speak or walk. And here's what really got me. I never saw any of them again during the rest of the cruise. Now, it's a big ship, sure, but I had a good memory for faces, especially ones I'd seen in such strange circumstances. The breaking point came on a Saturday night, almost 6 weeks into my contract. I was near the casino on Deck 8 when I saw them carrying a woman who looked exactly like someone I'd helped earlier that same night. Around midnight, she'd been tipsy but coherent, asking me for directions to her cabin. She'd shown me her key card, cabin 742, and I'd walked her there myself. She was traveling alone, she told me, a recent widow spending some of her husband's life insurance on a trip she'd always dreamed about. Now, at 3:30 a.m., here she was being carried by 2 crew members, completely unconscious, wearing the same silver dress. This time, I didn't hesitate. I stepped right in front of them, badge out, and demanded to know where they were taking her. The taller one, a Lithuanian guy from maintenance, just stared at me. The other one, someone from the spa staff, actually smiled. Not a friendly smile, but the kind that made your spine go rigid. "Step aside," the Lithuanian said, his accent thick. "This is authorized." When I asked for what authorization, whose authorization, he pulled out a radio and spoke rapidly in a language I didn't understand. Within 2 minutes, Gary appeared, which was strange because Gary never worked nights. He was wearing regular clothes, not his uniform, and his face was all business. He pulled me aside, gripped tight on my arm, and walked me away from the crew members who continued on with the woman. "Listen to me very carefully," he said, and his voice was different, harder than I'd ever heard it. "You're going to forget what you saw. You're going to go back to your normal patrol route, and you're going to stop making notes about things that don't concern you." When I protested that this was my job, that something illegal was happening, he leaned in close. "Your job is whatever we say it is. You've got 4 months left on your contract. You can finish it quietly and get your bonus, or you can be terminated at the next port for insubordination. No references, no final pay, and good luck explaining to your next employer why you got fired from a cruise ship." Then he said something that really chilled me. "That ex-wife of yours back in Phoenix, she's getting those alimony payments on time, right? Be a shame if you couldn't keep up with them." I went back to my cabin that morning and sat on my narrow bunk, trying to process what was happening. The threat was clear, but the reality of it was hitting me hard. I needed this job. The divorce had cleaned me out, and those alimony payments were court-ordered. If I lost this gig, I'd be in contempt of court within 2 months. But those passengers, something was happening to them. I couldn't just ignore it. I decided to be smarter about it. Instead of confronting anyone directly, I'd gather evidence quietly. I started using my phone to record videos during my patrols, keeping it in my chest pocket with the camera slightly exposed. I'd walk by those service elevators, hoping to catch something on film. For 3 nights, nothing. Then on night 4, I got lucky. Or unlucky, depending on how you look at it. I captured clear footage of 3 crew members carrying an unconscious man into the service elevator. His wallet had fallen out of his pocket, and one of them picked it up, pulled out the cash, and tossed the wallet into a trash bin. That was straight-up theft. No way to explain that away as VIP service. The next morning, we docked at Nassau. I had 6 hours of shore leave and used it to find an internet cafe away from the ship's Wi-Fi. I uploaded the video to my cloud storage and emailed copies to myself at 3 different email addresses. Then I did something else. I searched for news about missing cruise passengers. What I found made me sick. Over the past 2 years, 17 passengers had gone missing from various ships operated by our cruise line. The official reports always said the same thing: passenger disembarked at port and failed to return, or voluntary disembarkation documented. But family members were quoted saying their loved ones would never just leave, that their belongings were still in their cabins, that something was wrong. One woman's daughter said her mother had called her the night before she supposedly disembarked voluntarily in Jamaica, excited about the formal dinner that evening. She never made it to dinner, and according to the cruise line, she'd left the ship at 6 a.m. the next morning. No security footage, no witnesses, just a notation in the ship's log. I knew I had to do something, but I also knew I was trapped on that ship for another 4 months. Going to the authorities at port seemed like the obvious choice, but I needed more evidence, something undeniable. That night I did something stupid but necessary. I waited until 3 a.m., then used my security override to access the passenger manifest system. I looked up the woman from cabin 7412, the widow I'd tried to help. According to the system, she had disembarked that morning in Nassau. Voluntary departure, no forwarding address, no contact with the cruise line needed. But I'd seen her being carried unconscious just hours before we docked. Her cabin had already been cleaned and prepared for a new passenger arriving that day. I checked the others I'd made notes about. All of them showed the same thing: voluntary disembarkation at various ports, always within 24 hours of when I'd seen them being carried away. The pattern was clear and horrifying. They were taking passengers who were alone. getting them severely intoxicated somehow and then making them disappear at port, probably dumping them somewhere or selling them to human traffickers. The cruise line was covering it up with false records. My last night on the ship came sooner than expected. 3 days after Nassau, Gary came to my cabin with 2 other security officers. They searched everything, found my backup phone hidden in my mattress with all the videos and notes. Gary deleted everything while the others held me against the wall. "You're done," he said. "Next port is Cozumel. You're getting off there. Your final pay is forfeit due to breach of contract. We found evidence you've been stealing from passenger cabins." I started to protest, but he cut me off. "That's the story if you try to make trouble. We have your fingerprints on items from 3 different cabins where valuables went missing. You think anyone will believe a disgruntled fired security guard over a multi-billion-dollar cruise line?" They escorted me to a storage room in the crew area and locked me in. No phone, no way to contact anyone. They brought me food twice a day and let me use the bathroom under guard. When we docked at Cozumel, they marched me off the ship with just my passport and the clothes I was wearing, handed me $200 cash, and told me if I ever tried to contact the authorities or the media, they'd make sure I was arrested for theft. It took me 3 days to get back to Phoenix using the $200 for bus tickets and gas station food. When I got home, I found an email waiting in one of my backup accounts. The cloud storage links I'd sent from Nassau were still active. They'd deleted everything on my phones but hadn't known about the uploads. I had the video of them stealing from the unconscious passenger, plus all my notes with dates and times. I spent weeks trying to figure out what to do with it. Went to the FBI field office in Phoenix, but they said maritime crimes were complicated, especially in international waters. Tried calling journalists, but nobody wanted to touch a story about a major cruise line without more proof. The few who showed interest backed off quickly, said their editors wouldn't run it. I even contacted a maritime lawyer who told me bluntly that suing would be pointless. The cruise line would bury me in legal fees, and those employment contracts have arbitration clauses that basically sign away your right to sue anyway. Eventually, I gave up trying to go through official channels. But I couldn't just let it go completely. I started posting on cruise forums and travel warning sites, using anonymous accounts and VPNs, sharing what I'd witnessed without naming the specific cruise line. My lawyer had warned me about defamation suits. Some people believed me, others called me a conspiracy theorist, but every few months I'd see another news story about a missing cruise passenger, another voluntary disembarkation that didn't make sense. I know what's happening on those ships. Crew members are drugging solitary passengers, probably with something slipped into their drinks at the bars, then robbing them and getting rid of them at ports. Maybe they're selling them to traffickers. Maybe they're just dumping them unconscious in dangerous areas where they become robbery victims or worse. The cruise line covers it up, doctors the records, and threatens anyone who tries to speak up. I still have that video saved in a dozen different places, waiting for the day someone with real power decides to investigate. Until then, I tell anyone who will listen, if you're traveling alone on a cruise, never accept a drink you didn't see poured, never get severely intoxicated, and always make sure someone on land knows where you are. Because once you disappear at sea, you're just another voluntary disembarkation in the ship's log, and nobody's coming to look for you. I need everyone here to understand that what I'm about to share cost me my career, my reputation, and probably my sanity. 10 months ago, I was working security on the Atlantic Empress, one of those massive floating cities that carries 4,000 passengers plus crew. I'd been doing maritime security for 12 years before that. Started in the Coast Guard, then moved to commercial vessels. The pay was decent. The work was usually straightforward. Drunk passengers getting rowdy, occasional theft from staterooms, maybe a fight at the casino. Nothing could have prepared me for what happened during that voyage from New York to Bermuda. I still wake up at night thinking about Cabin 8247, about the Anderson family, and about how 4 people can simply stop existing while surrounded by thousands of others. The call came in around 10:30 p.m. on our second night at sea. I was doing my rounds on Deck 9 when my radio crackled. Housekeeping was reporting an issue with a stateroom on Deck 8. The night supervisor, a woman named Yolanda who'd been with the cruise line for 20 years, said something was wrong with one of the family suites. She wouldn't elaborate over the radio, just kept insisting I needed to come down immediately. Her voice had this edge to it that I'd never heard before. When I got there, she was standing outside 8247 with 2 of her staff members. They all had the same expression, confused and genuinely disturbed. Yolanda handed me the master keycard without saying a word and just pointed at the door. When I opened that cabin, I expected maybe vandalism, a medical emergency, or even a crime scene. What I found was nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing. The suite was pristine, like it had just been prepared for new passengers. The beds were made with fresh linens, corners tucked military style. The bathroom had wrapped soaps, folded towel arrangements, those little shampoo bottles lined up perfectly. The closets were empty, hangers evenly spaced. Even the welcome basket with the champagne bottles sat untouched on the coffee table. The promotional cruise materials fanned out like a deck of cards. But here's what made everyone uncomfortable. The manifest showed the Andersons had checked in 36 hours ago. A family of 4 from Michigan. Parents in their 40s, 2 teenage kids. I pulled up their records on my tablet right there in the doorway. Everything looked normal at first glance. They'd completed online check-in 2 weeks prior, uploaded their passport photos, selected their dinner seating. The embarkation system showed them boarding at 2:47 p.m. on departure day. Their keycards had been activated. Their safety drill attendance was marked complete. The dining system even showed they'd eaten dinner the first night. Table 42 in the main dining room. Orders placed at 7:23 p.m. The father had the salmon. The mother chose pasta primavera. The kids both got burgers. Their server, a guy named Antonio from Portugal, had even noted that they'd mentioned celebrating their daughter's acceptance to college. But standing in that empty cabin, none of it made sense. I immediately called the bridge and requested a full security protocol. Within minutes, I had 3 more officers with me, and we began a systematic search. We pulled the keycard logs for cabin 8247. The last entry was at 9:14 p.m. the previous night, right after dinner. The hallway cameras? Here's where things got weird. The footage showed the Andersons returning to their cabin at 9:14 p.m., exactly matching the keycard data. 4 people walked down that corridor. I watched it myself at least a dozen times. They were laughing about something. The father had his arm around his son's shoulder. They entered the cabin, the door closed, and that was it. No one left that room according to the cameras. But the next footage, from Yolanda's team arriving at 10:15 p.m. tonight to do turn-down service, showed them entering an already empty cabin. We reviewed every single camera on the ship, every elevator, every stairwell, every public area. The Andersons appeared in multiple locations throughout the first day and a half. The pool deck, the buffet for breakfast, walking through the promenade. The son played basketball with other teens at the sports court. The mother got a coffee at the cafe on Deck 6 around 3 p.m. on day 2. But after they entered their cabin at 9:14 p.m., they never appeared on another camera. I had my team check everything. The medical center in case they'd had an emergency. The brig in case something had happened that wasn't logged. Even the crew areas in case they'd somehow wandered where passengers shouldn't go. We discreetly checked other passenger cabins near 8247, thinking maybe there'd been a mix-up with room numbers. Nothing. 4 people had simply vanished from a locked metal box floating in the middle of the ocean. The chief security officer, a former Navy man named Douglas Crawford, took over the investigation around midnight. He brought in the hotel director, the staff captain, and eventually even woke up the captain himself. The entire senior leadership was now in the security office, watching the same footage, reviewing the same records, coming to the same impossible conclusion. Crawford made the call to begin interviewing staff members who'd had any interaction with the Andersons. That's when the inconsistencies started piling up. Antonio, the waiter from dinner, swore he'd served them both nights. He described their conversations in detail, mentioned the father was from Detroit, worked in automotive manufacturing. But the dining room manager showed us the system. Only one dinner was logged. When we checked Antonio's other tables from the second night, table 42 was marked as vacant, never seated. The pool attendant, a kid named Jeremy from California, remembered the son because they'd talked about surfing. He insisted he'd seen him at the pool that very afternoon, around 2 p.m. But when we checked the towel checkout system, the Andersons' cards had only registered on day 1. The spa had a booking for Mrs. Anderson for a massage at 4 p.m. on day 2. The therapist, Helen, said she'd waited 45 minutes, but the woman never showed. Yet Helen's colleague, working the next station, swore she'd seen Mrs. Anderson leaving the spa around 5 p.m., looking relaxed and thanking the staff. The boutique clerk had a receipt showing Mr. Anderson bought a watch that afternoon, paid with his key card, signature on file. But inventory showed that exact watch still in the display case, and the transaction wasn't in the point-of-sale system anymore, just the paper receipt that shouldn't have existed. By 3 a.m., Crawford pulled me aside into his private office. His face was gray and he looked older than I'd ever seen him. He told me that in 30 years of maritime security, he'd encountered 3 similar situations. Never 4 people at once, but passengers who just stopped existing. The cruise line had a protocol for this, he said, though it wasn't in any manual I'd ever read. We were to document everything, secure all evidence, and then wait for instructions from corporate. He made me sign something right there, a document I'd never seen before, with legal language about proprietary information and national maritime security. The way his hands trembled when he handed me the pen told me this was bigger than just our ship. He said corporate would handle the family notifications, that there would be a cover story about a medical evacuation by helicopter that happened while most passengers were asleep. The next morning came too fast. At 6 a.m., 2 men in suits boarded via the pilot boat. They weren't introduced to anyone, just went straight to the security office with Crawford. By 7 a.m., the Andersons' cabin was being occupied by a different family, the Washingtons from Oregon, who'd supposedly won a last-minute upgrade in a contest nobody remembered running. The crew members who'd reported inconsistencies were all called in for individual meetings. When they came out, they wouldn't talk about what was discussed, just went back to work like nothing had happened. Antonio suddenly remembered he'd been confused. That table 42 had been empty the second night after all. Jeremy admitted he must have mixed up the days. Helen's colleague realized she'd been mistaken about seeing Mrs. Anderson. The receipt from the boutique had disappeared, and the clerk insisted he'd never made that sale. I was given 2 choices that afternoon in Crawford's office, with those 2 suits standing behind him like gargoyles. Option 1, accept a promotion to a shoreside position with a 50% pay increase, full relocation package, and a glowing recommendation. Option 2, refuse and face immediate termination for security protocol violations they'd already documented against me, violations that hadn't existed an hour earlier. The catch with option 1? I had to sign another document, this one stating that the Anderson family had never boarded the Atlantic Empress, that cabin 8247 had been vacant due to a booking error, and that any suggestion otherwise would result in criminal prosecution for fraud and defamation. They had a psychiatrist ready to declare me unfit for duty if I chose wrong. Crawford wouldn't even look at me while they explained this. He just stared at his desk, jaw clenched so tight I could hear his teeth grinding. I took the promotion, God help me. Moved to a desk job in Seattle, never set foot on another ship. But I kept copies of everything, the original passenger manifest, the security footage on a drive I smuggled off the ship, the keycard logs, even photos of that impossible receipt. The Andersons were real. They boarded that ship. They ate in that dining room. They walked those corridors. And then somewhere between 9:14 p.m. when they entered their cabin and 10:15 p.m. when housekeeping found it empty, they ceased to exist in our reality. The cruise line knows this happens. They have a system for it. People who come aboard to clean it up, documents ready to silence anyone who asks questions. I've spent months trying to find the Andersons' family, friends, anyone who knew them. But every lead goes cold. It's like they never existed anywhere except on that ship for those 36 hours. Whatever took them, whatever happened in cabin 8247, the Atlantic Empress is still sailing, still carrying thousands of passengers who have no idea that some of them might simply disappear between one heartbeat and the next. I've worked on ships most of my adult life, and at the time of this story, I was serving as the chief engineer on a mid-sized cruise liner. The job wasn't glamorous. Most of my days were buried in noise, heat, and the constant vibration of the engine room. I lived for the routine, though. The checklist every morning, the hum of the machinery when everything was running right, the sense of responsibility that came with keeping the ship moving. It was during one of those routine maintenance checks, the kind you could almost do with your eyes closed, that things went very wrong. That day I remember stepping into the engine room with a mug of coffee that had already gone cold. The air was heavy, thick with oil and the faint metallic tang of heated steel. I was going over the generator's auxiliary system, something that should have been simple, but the pressure readings didn't match the logbooks. At first I thought it was just my eyes. Maybe I hadn't slept enough, but the numbers were way out of range. I leaned closer, listening to the uneven rattle of the machinery, and before I had the chance to shut things down, there was a snap so loud it felt like a gunshot. The sound was followed by a rush of steam and a jolt that knocked me back against the wall. When the emergency lock kicked in, sealing off the compartment, I realized I was trapped inside. My radio had slipped from my belt during the impact, skidding across the grated floor into a shallow pool of coolant. I could still hear the engines hammering away, steady as ever, but the room was filling with a thin mist that stung my throat every time I inhaled. My first thought was that someone would be on their way fast. Engine failures don't go unnoticed for long. But minutes kept passing. The lights above flickered, turning the room into a strange strobe of shadows and glints of metal. My watch ticked loud in the silence between the hums, and it hit me that nobody was coming right away. That's when I began noticing the little things. Gauges taped over, inspection tags with handwriting that didn't look like the usual signatures, dates that didn't line up. It wasn't just one oversight, it was deliberate. The logs had been padded, checks signed off without anyone actually doing them. Sitting there with my back against the trembling steel wall, it sank in that my accident wasn't just bad luck. It was the byproduct of someone cutting corners. I tried forcing the hatch open, but the emergency seal held tight, locking with a mechanical finality that told me I wasn't going anywhere until someone up top decided it was safe. My throat burned from the residue in the air, and every breath felt heavier than the last. I started pounding on the steel with a wrench, hoping the noise would carry, but all it did was echo back at me. It gave me too much time to think, and the more I thought, the clearer it became. Those logs hadn't just been fudged, they were falsified intentionally, probably to keep the ship on schedule. I'd heard rumors before. Engineers grumbling that inspections were rushed, or that management pressured crews to sign off on maintenance without shutting systems down, because downtime meant lost money. I always thought those stories were exaggerated, the kind of complaints guys made after long shifts. But sitting there, staring at the sloppy ink marks on tags that should have been official records, I couldn't deny it anymore. It was right in front of me, and now I was paying for it with every wheeze of my lungs. What really scared me was imagining how many other systems had been cleared the same way. If the auxiliary generator had been neglected, what about the emergency pumps, the lifeboat winches? The thought that passengers upstairs were trusting a ship being held together by forged paperwork was worse than my own situation. I couldn't stop picturing a full blackout in the middle of open water, alarms blaring while families lined up at lifeboats that might not even lower properly. Eventually, I heard voices faintly through the walls, muffled at first, then closer. They weren't rushing, though. It was almost casual, like they were debating what to do instead of scrambling to pull me out. That chilled me more than the steam. If they'd cut corners before, maybe rescuing me too quickly would raise questions they didn't want asked. I sat there gripping the wrench, not to defend myself, but because it was the only thing grounding me as I realized my accident wasn't just a fluke. It was a symptom of something bigger, and the people in charge might not be in any hurry to expose it. When they finally unsealed the hatch, 2 crewmen stood there, faces pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. They didn't look relieved to see me alive. More uneasy, like my survival complicated things. One of them, a younger guy named Ellis, muttered something about a malfunction as he helped me out, avoiding my eyes the whole time. The other scribbled notes on a clipboard without even glancing at the wrecked equipment. It felt rehearsed, like they already had a story prepared before opening that door. I expected to be rushed straight to medical, but instead they led me down a service corridor that bypassed most of the passenger areas. The doctor only showed up after a long delay, gave me a quick check and told me to rest. No real questions, no thorough examination, just a pat on the shoulder and a promise everything was handled. Lying there, my chest still raw from breathing in the fumes, I couldn't shake the thought that what they wanted most was for me to shut up and move on. The next morning, I went back to the engine room on my own. The section that nearly killed me had already been cleaned up, the tags replaced with fresh ones, dates neatly aligned this time. It looked like nothing had ever happened, but I knew the truth. I'd seen the altered logs, the fake signatures, the sloppy ink smears. Someone had buried the evidence overnight, and I realized if I spoke up too loudly, I might not have a career to return to, or worse, I might disappear into the sea like plenty of other problem ships conveniently lose. I never told the passengers. I couldn't. But after we docked, I turned in my resignation and walked away from that ship for good. To this day, I don't know how far up the chain the cover-up went, but I know what I saw down there wasn't a mistake. It was systematic. Every time I hear about another accident at sea, I wonder if the same shortcuts are still being taken, hidden behind polished brochures and promises of safety. I survived that night, but I'll never step foot in an engine room again. Back then, I worked as a safety officer on a passenger ship. It wasn't glamorous like people imagine. Most of my days were spent buried in manuals, making sure procedures were followed, and checking that drills didn't turn into chaos. I'd been on that particular contract for 3 months, and by then I had memorized every corner of the vessel, the narrow stairwells, the smell of oil near the engine access, even the echo of the PA system when announcements crackled late at night. Life at sea felt repetitive, but that repetition was supposed to mean safety. That was my job. Predictability, order, and control. Or at least that's what I thought. The incident happened during a mandatory lifeboat drill. These drills were routine, nothing the crew or passengers ever got excited about. My role was to oversee the release system, make sure each boat lowered smoothly into the water and came back up without a hitch. I remember standing near the launch mechanism, clipboard in hand, trying to ignore the grumbling of passengers who didn't understand why the process took so long. Everything was supposed to run by the book that day, except it didn't. The first jolt was so sudden that people screamed before they even realized what had happened. One of the lifeboats slammed down against the side of the ship, the cable grinding as if it had snapped halfway. The boat didn't detach completely, but it hung at an angle so sharp I could see 2 passengers gripping the rails with white knuckles. Another lifeboat, moments later, dropped so violently, it nearly crushed a deckhand who had been signaling with his flashlight. The sound was deafening, metal scraping against metal, followed by panicked shouts that rolled down the deck like a wave. I rushed toward the panel, my mind racing, but the override controls lagged as though the system had been neglected far too long. We managed to stop the drill before anyone was physically hurt, but the air was thick with fear and confusion. Passengers were escorted back inside while officers tried to reassure them it was only a mechanical error. But I knew better. The equipment didn't just fail out of nowhere. I had flagged those very cables in previous notes, pointing out the wear, the rust, the stiffness that meant inspections were overdue. And yet, the official logbook, the one I wasn't allowed to access directly, always showed every inspection as complete and passed. That was the first moment I realized something wasn't adding up. After the drill, a meeting was called in one of the small conference rooms reserved for crew briefings. The captain tried to keep the tone calm, but his jaw was tight the entire time. I sat near the back, listening as the chief engineer blamed unexpected stress on the system. That explanation didn't sit right with me. I had seen the frayed cables, the faded labels, the kind of small details you only notice when you actually spend hours inspecting equipment. When I spoke up and said those lifeboats should have been serviced weeks ago, the room went silent. Few officers glanced at me, then quickly looked away, like I had broken some unspoken rule. Later that evening, I decided to check the maintenance logs myself. Normally, those records were kept in a locked cabinet in the safety office, but I had a key as part of my role. When I pulled out the binder, the pages looked too perfect. Every inspection marked passed, every box ticked with the same neat handwriting. But here's the thing. I knew the officer whose signature was on the forms, and his handwriting had always been sloppy, barely legible. These entries looked like they had been copied straight from a template. I remember staring at the pages, realizing someone had gone to the trouble of forging entire months of inspections. The following day, I was summoned by my direct superior, a man named Captain Lewis. He wasn't unkind, but he had a way of speaking that left no room for questions. He closed the office door behind me and slid a stack of new paperwork across the desk. "We'll need you to sign this, confirming that yesterday's drill was successful and that no safety hazards were present." His tone was casual, almost rehearsed. I stared at the paper, then at him. The form essentially erased everything that had just happened. The near miss, the terrified passengers, the obvious equipment failure. It was as if the whole event was being rewritten before it had even settled in people's memories. I pushed the papers back toward him and said I couldn't sign something that wasn't true. His expression hardened instantly. He leaned forward, lowering his voice, telling me that if I refused, it would create unnecessary trouble for the company and for me. That phrase stuck with me. Unnecessary trouble. In his eyes, a lifeboat nearly crushing people wasn't the issue. The issue was me putting it on record. I left his office with my chest tight, caught between the duty I had sworn to uphold and the unspoken expectation to stay quiet. It was the first time I truly questioned whether integrity had a place on that ship. That night I couldn't sleep. I walked the length of the deck, the ship cutting through the dark water, and I kept thinking about how close we had come to a disaster. Passengers were laughing in the lounge, drinking cocktails, completely unaware of the fact that the very boats meant to save their lives might not even hold together in an emergency. The contrast between their carefree faces and the weight pressing on me made me feel isolated, like I was carrying a secret no one wanted to admit existed. Every creak of the ship, every vibration from the engines, made me wonder what else had been ignored or covered up. 2 days later, I was approached by another officer, Mark Holloway, someone I'd known since training. He caught me in the corridor and quietly warned me to drop it. His eyes darted to the security camera above us before he walked away. That shook me more than anything because Mark wasn't the type to get involved in politics. If he was telling me to stay quiet, it meant the problem was bigger than I had realized. I started to notice how conversations stopped when I walked into a room, how certain crew members avoided eye contact. It was like the entire ship had agreed that silence was safer than truth. I held my ground until the end of that contract, refusing to sign any false documents. When I finally disembarked, I filed an anonymous report with the Maritime Safety Board. I never heard back directly, but months later I read a small news piece about a fleet-wide audit for the company and several senior staff members being retired early. There was no mention of forged logs, no details about lifeboats, But I knew what had triggered it. The ship I had worked on was reassigned, and the next time I looked, its name had disappeared from the company's official brochures. Even now, years later, I think about those passengers clinging to the rails of that lifeboat, their faces pale under the emergency lights. It still bothers me that the official story erased what they went through, that their fear was rewritten as a successful drill. I sometimes wonder if anyone else on board remembers it the way I do, or if they've all convinced themselves it never happened. What I do know is this: I'll never forget standing there, holding a clipboard, realizing that the very systems built to save lives had been turned into props for a lie. And that silence, not the sea, was the real danger on that ship. I'd been working as a bartender on cruise ships for a few years when this particular trip happened. At that point in my life, I was 26, single, and mostly living out of a suitcase. I liked the routine of setting up the bar, hearing where people were from and catching little glimpses of their vacations. I knew regular passengers came and went, but crew members like me stayed long enough to notice patterns: who drank too much, who tipped well, and who made others uncomfortable. That night started like many others, with music in the background, laughter echoing from the pool deck, and the smell of salt drifting in whenever the doors opened. There were a few men who always stood out. They weren't the type of people who blended into the crowd. They dressed sharp, but it wasn't just the clothes. It was the way they carried themselves, too sure of their place, always leaning on the bar like they owned it. They were pushy with their orders, tossing bills onto the counter without even making eye contact. What really caught my attention was how security treated them. Normally, security checked IDs for anyone who looked even slightly underage or suspicious. But with these guys, it was as if they were invisible. No questions, no hesitation. Drinks passed straight into their hands. I started paying closer attention when I saw how they targeted younger women. Most of the girls were clearly college age, traveling in groups of friends, soaking up the freedom of being away from home. The men would buy rounds without asking, sliding drinks into hands like it was part of some unspoken agreement. I noticed a girl one evening. Her name was Emma, if I remember correctly. She had auburn hair tied up in a messy bun and wore this oversized hoodie that made her look even younger than she probably was. One of the men kept circling her group, offering cocktails and trying to separate her from her friends. Later that same night, I saw Emma again, this time walking toward one of the side exits with that same man trailing beside her. Something about the way he held his hand just barely on her arm made me uneasy, like he was guiding her somewhere she hadn't fully agreed to go. I thought about stepping in, but there's this unspoken pressure when you're crew. You don't cross certain lines unless you're ready for a storm of trouble. Still, I made a mental note of it, promising myself I'd keep an eye out for her the next day. The following afternoon, her friends came up to the bar asking if anyone had seen Emma. They were laughing nervously at first, assuming she'd stayed out late and crashed in another cabin, but as the hours passed, the joking tone faded. I checked the usual spots: the pool deck, the casino, even the lounge where passengers sometimes napped, but she was nowhere. When her friends circled back again, they looked different, more restless. That's when I mentioned I'd last seen her walking with one of the men. Their faces tightened, like they suddenly realized something they didn't want to say out loud. I brought it up discreetly to one of the security guards I knew, a guy named Ryan, who'd been on several contracts with me. His reaction was strange. He didn't ask for details, didn't even look surprised. Instead, he told me to let it go, and that passengers wandered off all the time. But Emma wasn't the type to just vanish. Her hoodie had still been hanging on the back of a chair near the bar that morning, the same one she'd worn the night before. It felt like a breadcrumb left behind, proof she hadn't just wandered off the way Ryan tried to explain. The following night, I decided to check the security office myself. Crew aren't supposed to just walk in there, but I'd built a rapport with some of the guards, and I used that to get inside. The screens showed feeds from every corner of the ship. I asked to review the footage from the side exit where I'd seen Emma leave with that man. The room fell quiet, One guard clicked through the system, and the feed jumped strangely, like time had been cut away. Hours of recordings were gone, replaced with blank gaps. The guard avoided my eyes and muttered something about technical errors, but I'd worked long enough on ships to know what that really meant. By then, the whispers among the crew had started. Other bartenders and cleaners told me stories of women who had gone missing before, brushed aside with official statements about seasickness or choosing to disembark early. The pattern lined up too neatly. The same men, the same avoidance by security, the same erasures in the surveillance logs. I realized then that this wasn't some isolated incident. It was something bigger, something the cruise line itself was willing to bury as long as it kept the money flowing and the passengers entertained. I filed a written report anyway, even knowing how things usually ended. The following day, I went back to check whether any progress had been made, but the supervisor acted like the report had never existed. My words had vanished, just like the footage. Emma's friends were told she must have decided to cut her trip short, even though her belongings were still in her cabin. I overheard one officer saying she'd probably just slipped away at port, but that didn't explain why her room key hadn't been used again after that night. A few days later, I confronted one of the men at the bar. He smirked when I mentioned Emma, leaning in close enough for me to smell the cologne heavy on his jacket. "Careful what you ask," he said, before sliding a wad of bills across the counter and walking away. It wasn't a threat in words, but it was enough to keep me awake for the rest of the night, staring at the ceiling in my tiny cabin, wondering just how much the company knew and how much they were willing to cover up. When the cruise ended, I tried reaching out to authorities on land. I explained what I had seen, who the men were, and how the footage had been wiped. The officer on the phone listened politely, but stopped me as soon as I mentioned the missing video. "If the ship's logs don't show it," he said, "then it didn't happen." That was the line. Without proof, Emma was just another passenger who supposedly chose to disappear. I realized then that the system wasn't built to help someone like her. It was built to protect the company. I still think about Emma more than I'd like to admit. Her friends never got answers, and I never got closure. I eventually left that job, not because of the long hours or the endless nights, but because I couldn't keep pouring drinks for men like that knowing what might happen after. Even now, whenever I hear stories of people vanishing at sea, I picture her hoodie draped over that chair and the gap in the security footage where she should have been. It's the silence around it that haunts me most. The kind that tells you the truth was buried long before anyone ever asked the questions.